Hello and welcome to week 7. This week you're going to be learning how to do some more things with CSS. We will learn about playing with fonts, with font sizes, we'll play with colors, and this thing called the box model. For this week I created another document, and this document I called the basics of webdesign.html. Notice it has underscores in it. Remember, we can't have any spaces. The other thing that I did is I added it to my index, so I have a link to it. And it's just a basic page. Once again, we start off with our doc type declaration. We have our HTML declaration, our head, our body, our header, which just simply has the, so this is basics of images. I'm going to call this web design. Then I have my navigational area with my links at the top of the page, which is here. I have some text that is contained in my content div. Notice these are paragraph tags. These are just simply lorem ipsum text, which is dummy text. We went over that in the first week video. I have my footer and then my closing tags. So this should look fairly familiar to you. So if I refresh, if I save this, and then I refresh. Okay, so basics of web design. This is what we're going to be working on today. All right, what I want to show you is you have these two paragraphs of text in here, and right now I have not formatted this text at all. It shows up, and one thing you need to be aware of before you get started, whenever we play with text, there is what's called serif fonts and sans serif fonts. Okay, so I want to show you the difference. A serif is these little things that are on the end of the letters, the little hooks that appear. And certain types of letters have them. A sans serif, which sans, by the way, means without the serif, these are letters that don't have the little hooks on the end of them. A serif font is considered to be easier to read when it is printed. A sans serif font is easier to read on the screen. So whenever we play with any fonts, any text, we want to make sure that we use a sans serif font unless we have some specific reason for using a serif font. Now typically what you'll see is with the serif fonts, you will see people use those to make emphasis or to make some part of the page stand out. But what you will notice is people that do that make the page where it looks well or looks good, it'll typically be a bigger font size because we need a bigger font to be able to read the serif font as easily as a sans serif font. So once again, serif font should be on print or a single word or small phrase or something that's in emphasis. A sans serif font down here, this is what we're going to use for our web pages. Okay, so if you notice the serif font, this is actually our standard font. We typically end up with Times New Roman. And Times New Roman is a serif font. We don't want that to be our font. So what I can do is I can play with some styling. Alright, so I want to play with the P tag here. And what I'm going to play with is the fonts. I have font family, font styles, I have font sizes, weights, and things like that that I can play with. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say my styles equal to, and I'm going to do font family. Okay, now what font family do I want? Now our basic sans serif font that appears on every computer is Arial, and we did talk about this in a previous video. So I showed you how you could do Arial, then Courier, then Times New Roman, or whatever else. So I want it to be Arial. I know Arial is on almost every computer out there, so that will change my font for that one paragraph. But I don't want it just to affect this one paragraph. I want it to affect all of the paragraphs that are in my document. So instead of putting it here, I'm going to put it up in my head. Okay, so my embedded heading or embedded style in my head, and what I want to do is I want to manipulate every P tag. Okay, how do I want to manipulate them? I want my font family to be Arial. And now it affects all of my paragraphs. Alright, now my font is a little small. I want to make the font a little bit bigger. Then what I'm going to play with is going to be the font size CSS attribute. Okay, so now I have font size. I have a couple of ways I can play with this. I can change the size of the font based on its percentage of its current size. I could change the font size in terms of pixels. I could designate exactly how many pixels tall the font should be. Or I can use what's called an EM value. And EM, it's just supposed to be an M. And what that is it's what is its current size versus what it should be. Okay, and I'll show you the two most common ones are going to be something like this. I want to make my font size 12 pixels. And if I make it 12 pixels, then what you'll notice is that each letter is exactly 12 pixels tall. Okay, that's great, but what happens is in some browsers, when people zoom in, the font size may or may not actually change, because some browsers will keep that 12 pixels as literal, and you can zoom in and out and you won't necessarily see the different font size. Okay, so what is actually considered to be better is to use what are called M values. Okay, so I want my font size to be a percentage of its regular size. Now, the default size is 1 EM. That's 100% of its regular size. That's what 1 M means. Okay, so if I want it to be 120% of its original size, I'm going to make it 1.2 M. And when I refresh, now it's bigger. If I want to make it smaller, let's say I want to be 80% of its original size, then I'll make it 0.8 M. This is the preferred way to increase and decrease a font size. And the reason for it is it makes it proportional to what size it would have been originally. That way, if somebody has a screen reader, if they have different styles that are set up for accessibility, you won't mess with their styles. If they have it set up for large font and you use a PX size, it's going to force it to be that PX size. If you use M, then it'll just be a percent of what it should have been. So if they have it already set as an extra large font on their computer and then you make it a 1.2 M, then it just simply makes it 120% bigger. Alright, so this is the way that we should be playing with our font size. Alright, so this is a little small. We're going to put this back to 1.2 M. And there's my font size. Okay, I can play with things like font weight. And the font weight is going to be, how do I want the font to appear on the screen? Do I want it to be regular? Do I want it to be bold? Do I want it to be skinnier? Do I want it to be an outline? Sorry, not an outline, but do I want it to be really thin? And I can do that kind of stuff. So what I'm doing here is I have a font weight of bold. And when I have my font weight of bold, it actually will make this whole thing bold. I can make it bolder. Okay, now certain browsers may or may not actually be able to display them depending on the size. So bolder is not doing anything. Okay, I can do lighter. I can do normal. But once again, what I actually want to play with are going to be specific values. Okay, so instead of using a word, I want to use numbers. And I can use numbers in terms of 100 to 900. Okay, so 400 is considered to be normal. And then 700 is bold. And then 900 would be the equivalent of bolder. Now, like I said, some browsers will be able to interpret these. Some fonts have these abilities to be bolder or skinnier. But like I said, if you want this to be just a little wider than normal, let's make it a 500. And then if I really don't want that, let's try 100. Okay, now you notice this font in this browser, Internet Explorer, it is not capable of making it skinnier. So I would have to play with different fonts to be able to use that. Alright, so I want this font to be italic. Before I do that, I'm going to put this back to 400, which remember 400 weight is normal. And so I'm going to play with the font style. And I'll set it to italic. And now if I refresh, now you'll see that's italic. Now italic is leaning just a little bit. But I can also use oblique, which means not at a right angle. And oblique is leaning just a tiny bit more. Some fonts you will see that italic leans more. Some fonts oblique will lean more. It just depends on how the browser decides to display it and what font you're using. Okay, so I'm going to put this back to normal. Alright, so I can do things like I can center text, I can align it left, I can align it to the right. So to do that, I'm going to make a new line, and this time I'm going to play with the text align. Okay, so notice this time I'm not playing with the font, I'm playing with the text. And how do I want to align it? I want to align it, and I have left, center, and right that I can play with. Now left is going to be the default. So if I play with it left, there's left. And I have center, if I can spell right. Okay, so I can center the text in here, and I can do right. Okay, so I'm going to put it back to the left because that's where I actually want it to be. One other one that I can play with is what's called justify. So I'm going to change this from left to justify. And what you'll notice right now is align left, all of these words end at different places over here. Now, when you have a textbook, when they justify the letters, it stretches the words out so they go all the way from one side to the other. So if I refresh this, you will notice now that it actually spaces these all out so that it lines up just like it does in Word or any of your textbooks where you have it justified. I can even play with the text in the way that it is capitalized. Like right now it's in what's called sentence case. So the first word of each sentence is a capital letter. Let's say I don't want it to be that way. I want everything to be capital letters. I can play with what's called a text transform. And I can make it uppercase, lowercase, or normal. So I'm going to make everything uppercase. When I refresh, all of the letters now are uppercase. This is yelling. Don't do this. Okay, but if I want it all to be lowercase, now everything's lowercase. Now remember, this is just strictly a style that is transforming the letters. So what we see as lowercase letters really is not. So if they actually were to cut and paste this text, it's going to cut and paste as lowercase. But if we try to use it in a script where we're trying to read in the words, it's going to read the words in as their normal words. So just be careful when you play with this uppercase and lowercase here that you don't try to use it in a form or something like that to verify the words that they're using. Okay, so I'm going to make it normal, and normal is going to put it back to our normal sentence case. Now when we're playing with paragraphs in an actual document, typically you'll see that the first line is indented, and we can actually do that with the text indent CSS element. And I have the ability to indent it so many pixels, or I can indent it based on so many M's. And so I'm going to indent it by 10 pixels. And now I get a little bit of an indent. You know, if I do like 50 pixels, I get more, starting to look more like what we would see as our typical half-inch indent. The thing is, as I zoom in and out, that indent doesn't really increase at all. So notice it's still staying strictly 50 pixels. Okay, so instead of doing 50 pixels, I'm going to do something like 3M. Okay, now what will happen is as I zoom, Internet Explorer will read it as being this way, but other browsers will allow it to automatically indent as it needs to be. So we do have the ability to play based on the size of the font that's in here also. Okay, so enough playing with the different things with the fonts. What I want to show you is the basics of this thing called the box model. Now the box model is the way that we actually align things. So we have, let's say on a piece of paper, when you're writing a document, when you have margins on the sides, the edge of our piece of paper is the outside of our box that we can play with whenever we have a piece of paper. And then you have this 1-inch margin into the content and so forth. Well, we actually have that same kind of structure when we're playing with elements on a page. So I have my actual content that is contained within a specific item. So what I'm going to have is my box is going to be my browser window, or actually the space where the element should be on the page. then I have a margin that will exist from the outside of the page into the border of my item. So this would be like on your piece of paper where you have your 1-inch margin. That would be to here. And then we would typically put text here, but we can actually, we have a border, and then on the inside we have padding, and then we have a content to play with. So what I want to show you is we're going to play with a border. I'm going to make a 1 pixel solid black border around every paragraph element. Okay, so what the purpose of this is for me to show you what the difference is going to be, how we can actually play with this, how we can make things move around on the page based on this box model. So what you'll notice right now is I have this tiny little white border down the side of my box here between the actual border and the side of the page. And then I have another little white box here. And if you imagine, there are actually 2 of them here. There's half of this is for the top paragraph and half of it is for the bottom paragraph. And then I have the same little white margin over here. This is my margin. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the size of my margin. And so my margin, I'm going to set it to be 20 pixels so that way you can see what it does. And when I refresh this, watch the space between the side of the page and the side of the box. Okay, so what I just did is I increased my margin from the side of the page to the side of the box. Alright, so what I can play with is things like the margin and the padding. Now the margin is outside of the box, and the padding is the space from the box to the content that is actually inside of there. So I'm going to play with the padding also. And I'm going to make the padding 15 pixels. And this time, watch from the box to the words. So now what I'm doing is I'm making more space inside. And if I make this a 25 pixels, I can increase it. Okay, so now I have this different padding here. I can manipulate it a little bit more. Okay, so my margin, I want to play with different margins. I have a left margin, a top margin, a right margin, and a bottom margin. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play with margin left. Now my left margin I'm going to make 20 pixels, and I'm not going to define the other ones. Okay, so watch what happens this time. Notice my margin on the left here stayed 20 pixels, but on the right it didn't change. Alright, so I can play with margin right, and let's say we'll make this 30 pixels just so you can see what happens. Okay, so there's my margin right, and I can make that even more if I want, so 60, just to make it a little bit more pronounced. So you can see this is 20 over here, this is 60 over here, and it'll do this no matter how big I make the browser window. So if I maximize this, you'll see that I have the same border, 60 pixels and 20 pixels over here. So that part doesn't change. Alright, so I want to play with the margin from the top. And the margin from the top, I'm going to make it 30 pixels. Come over here, refresh. Okay, so I'm moving it down a little bit. And the margin from the bottom, I'm going to make it 55 pixels. Okay, so watch the space here. Okay, so I'm increasing the space in the bottom. Alright, so all of this is just simply letting me move the things around a little bit based on where they should be. But what I'm doing is I'm not manipulating their location. I'm manipulating how much space there is between where the outside of this border is versus where it should have been originally, because the outside box, the outside of the piece of paper is still sitting here. So this is the outside of the piece of paper. So how big is my margin? How big is this? Okay, so I want to show you a shorthand way to do this. I can define all of these margins if I want to, but instead what I want to do is do something like this. I'm going to say margin, and I'm going to define 4 values all within this one element. And so the way that it works is top, right, bottom, left. So once again, top, right, bottom, left. So the top I'm going to make 40 pixels. The right I'm going to make 30 pixels. The bottom I'm going to make 60 pixels. And the left I'm going to make 15 pixels. So top, right, bottom, left. Refresh this. There you go. All right, so it'll always be in this order, but I have to define all 4 of them if I want to define them individually. So I can either do margin dash top, margin dash right, margin dash bottom, margin dash left, or I can do margin and put all 4 of them in here. Or if I do margin and I only define 2 of them, then it'll be top and the right. If I define 3, it'll be top, right, bottom. So it is one of those things where it'll understand how to process them, but it's going to always interpret these as being, if you define more than one, top, right, bottom, left, every time. Okay, so the padding is the same way. I can do padding dash left, or I can just do padding, and once again, top, right, bottom, left. So 10 pixels on the top, 20 pixels on the right, say 30 pixels on the bottom, and 20 pixels on the left. Refresh, and there you go. So here's my 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, and then 20 pixels. Now my border itself works about the same way, but the thing you'll notice is that it's actually a little overloaded, because right now my border has the thickness, what kind of line it has, and then what color it is. And if I want to change this, let's say I don't want it to be black, I can change this to a different color. And all I do is just simply use the RGB value. So I put a number sign and then the RGB value for it. And it'll refresh and change the color. Okay, so I want to make it lighter. So you can actually see it change. So I'm just changing the color based on the RGB values of it. Okay, so what I want to do though is I want to make different borders on the top, the right, the bottom, the left. Well, I can do that. Okay, now if I just do border, it's like margin. If I do border, this does all of them. But I can do something like border left. And now I only have a border on the left-hand side. Now you'll notice that my text wrapped a little bit differently because that 1 pixel border takes up space in my box model. Okay, so now I've released 1 pixel of space over here, so it did rewrap everything. Okay, so I can do border top and make this 3 pixels dotted red, and border bottom 2 pixels dashed green. We have all sorts of different ones we can play with, but now what I can do is I can make them different based on the different sides. And I can make them different thicknesses if I want. So instead of 2 pixels, I want this to be 12 pixels. Now it's a lot thicker. But notice it only affected the one on the bottom here. It did not affect the other 2. And I can leave those off if I want to also. Alright, so this is a little bit ugly. I don't really like it. So I'm going to make this a little bit different. We're going to make it all 3 pixels dotted green, just to have it all one color. Oops, and I left this border left, so I'm going to make it border. There we go. That's our border. Okay, so now what I can do is my borders in newer versions of Internet Explorer, most versions of Chrome, most versions of Firefox, Safari, and so forth, we can play with what are called a radius, or we can play with rounded corners. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to play with my border radius. And my border radius, I give it so many pixels. And imagine what the pixels are is the radius for a circle. So the lower the number of pixels, the smaller a circle, the less of a curve you get. The larger the number, the bigger the radius, the larger the circle, the bigger curve you get. So I'm going to make it 15 pixels for a radius here. And if you watch this corner when I refresh, it gets rounded. Okay, so if I do something like 35 pixels, it gets even more. And if I do 90 pixels. Okay, now one thing to be aware of is my radius cuts right through the middle of my box model. Notice what it did here is it actually cut right through the word. this border radius does not actually affect my box. My box still goes out here. So imagine a right angle up here. That's where my box is. The radius is just strictly an overlay on top of it. So make sure that whenever you play with these that you're not going to have a radius that is so big that it'll go outside of the box model. Or I'm sorry, inside of the box model where the letters overlay it. So you want to use a small radius. That way it's just something that isn't quite so cut up like the right angles are, but it makes it look a little bit nicer. I want to make this look a little bit better. So the next thing I can play with is this thing called a box shadow. Now a box shadow is going to be the shadow behind this element to make it look like it's raised up off of the page. It just gives it a little bit of height and a little bit of life. So what I'm going to do is we have three values that we need to define. Our first one is going to be how far to the left or right do we want it. And a negative number would move it left, a positive number would move it to the right. How far do we want it up or down? So a negative number would move it up, a positive number would move it down. And then how wide do we want it? How much do we want it to blur? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it 20 pixels to the right, 10 pixels down, and I'm going to make it 15 pixels and what's called a blur. So how far does it actually stretch out? Okay, and then the last thing is what color do I want it to be? So I'm going to make it like a medium gray color. And when I refresh this, you will now see a little bit of a border here. Okay, so it's not really enough. I want to move it a little bit more. 30. Let's move it down. 20. And come over here and refresh. And it moved just a little bit more. Okay, I want it to be blurred some more, so I'm going to make this a 35 pixels of a blur. And notice it just made it a little bit deeper. Alright, so I don't necessarily like this color. Well, what I can do is I can go and look for a color picker. Okay, and a color picker is going to look like this. It's just a website that lets me go and pick out a color that I like. So I want to make this a dark green to kind of match our green that we already have. Let's say something like this. So let's go with this color and come over here and paste it. And so now it gives me a little bit of a lighter green color. You may or may not be able to see it in the video, but what I'd like you to do is play with it on your computer and you see the different colors. But what you're trying to do is just simply give this element a little bit of body. So now we've played with the basics of using CSS to manipulate our font. We played with the font style. We changed the font face to be a sans serif font. Make sure you're aware that we want sans serif fonts when we're playing on the web usually, unless we have some specific reason for using a serif font. We played with using the border radius and then our shadows. One thing I do want you to be aware of is that you do have these color pickers online. I would suggest going online, searching for color pickers, look for color wheels. There are what are called web palettes. Make it real easy to find colors that go together. And the next part of your assignment is going to be to go on to Blackboard and to check for the requirements for this week's portion of your semester project. If you do have any questions, let me know. Have a good week, and I will see you soon.